July 29 is Earth Overshoot Day. That's the day when the global population will have used all the natural resources the Earth can provide and replace in the space of a year. That includes crops, livestock, timber, seafood and urban infrastructure. Now, if that wasn't alarming enough, Australia's Earth Overshoot Day was actually back in March. Well, joining me now to discuss this further is Matthijs Vakkenagel, the president of the Global Footprint Network, which carried out the study. Mr. Vakkenagel, thank you very much for joining me this evening. Talk us through the Overshoot Day rankings. How does Australia compare to the rest of the world?
Great pleasure to talk with you. Australia has a very high ecological footprint, meaning it uses resources much more than the world average. For the world average, as you said, we use about 1.75-fold what Earth can renew. And if you translate that into a date, that means between January 1st and July 29th today, we have used as much as Earth can renew in the entire year.
So how do you actually calculate each country's overshoot day? What sort of data are we talking about here?
It's extremely straightforward. We use UN data sets. We look at all the resource demands of every country. So how many potatoes, how much cotton, how much milk, how much cheese, how much of everything, how much CO2 emissions does your country have? And we translate that into how much ecologically productive space is necessary to produce these amounts. So we can add up everything, and that becomes our ecological footprint. And then we can compare that area with how much is available on the planet or within your country. And so that's basically a simple balance sheet, even more simple than financial accounting.
So if the world is using up its resources quicker than we can replace them, how are we still doing it?
It's possible, like with money, you can spend more money than you earn for some time if you have assets. And the same thing is true for our ecological assets. We can overuse fisheries and forests. We can pump CO2 in the atmosphere more rapidly than it's being sequestered, etc. So we can run up a debt, but you cannot do it forever. So by doing that, we are living on a metabolism, on a resource demand that will not be able to be maintained in the long run.
So I guess we can sort of...
the big question is, will we get...
I guess we can describe this this sort of period now as sort of like a boom period in terms of the resources that we can regenerate. But given our declining resources,
yes,
climate change and global extinction rates and so forth, it appears that we're in the later stage of that boom.
Absolutely. So it's a bit like a Ponzi scheme. You can maintain it. You can maintain a pyramid scheme by using up the future for and paying. Future, it's possible for some time, but not forever.
So what's sort of like a ballpark figure here? Like how long until this boom actually runs out?
I mean, in some arena that already is running out very quickly. Like, for example, we have overused the atmosphere, so we have emitted more CO2 already than can be allowed if you want to stay within 2 degrees Celsius climate change, for example. And the more we emit, the higher is the risk for rapid climate change. But the point is also that doing something against it actually is in your own interest. We just did a white paper with Schneider Electric, a large company with 140,000 employees, to make the case that if you recognize the global limits in your own business strategy, you're much more likely to succeed. And the argument is quite simple. If you provide services and products as a company that are needed in the future, you're more likely to be needed in the future yourself. If you produce things that are not needed, it's more difficult for you to operate. So recognizing physical reality is core even to business strategies if you want to have a long-term success strategy.
What about us in terms of consumers? What can we do to sort of curtail that in an everyday matter of speaking?
I mean, the big question is, do we want to? That's the big question. If you see it as a self-interest story, it's much easier to act. And actually, there is a self-interest story for cities, for countries, for individuals, meaning that if you invest in things that have a future that can operate without using a lot of fossil fuel and resources, these assets will be much more valuable. So it applies to your own house. Do you have a house that requires a lot of transport and heating and cooling? If you do, then that asset is likely to lose in value in the future. The same is true. Are you able to have a great diet without depending too much on resources? Then also you're able to operate much more effectively in a resource-efficient world. So what we haven't really understood, I think, very well is that moving towards sustainability is not just a noble, nice thing to do. it's a necessary thing. It's like brushing your teeth is not a noble thing. It's a necessary thing. And that's what the message we're trying to show with Move to Date. It's possible to do. It's financially advantageous, but we still hold it as a burden, as a noble thing that we may do on Sunday afternoons, while actually in reality, it needs to be at the core of the way we develop our cities, we develop our countries, we develop our own companies.
But the next big issue is population growth, because but from the time that I started talking to you now for this interview, it's estimated that around 1,400 people have been born just in those few minutes. It's obviously quite a big issue that we have here, and it's not as easy as just telling people to stop having children. So how do we sort of tackle that problem?
Right now I'm talking to you from Madrid. If we had the reproductive rates of Spain, Portugal or Italy, we would be getting to a world population of 4 billion people by 2100. And I've met people already that will live in 2100. You know, the people who's born today, they will most likely actually live up to 2100. The median projection right now is going up to 11.6 billion people in the world. So there's this threefold difference of number of people that could be on the planet depending on what strategies we choose. It's quite possible by investing more in women, in family planning, and making sure everybody has equal rights, that families get much smaller. And that will be a big boon, we believe, to the next generations. So population numbers are a big driver as well, and underestimated, and actually they provide huge opportunities also for increasing social well-being. So it's not about sacrifice or blaming anybody. It's just a sound strategy for the next generation to have great lives.
Are there any sustainability measures that
generations.
Are there any sustainability measures that a government anywhere in the world right now is adopting that you think is a good idea and that should actually be adopted more widely?
Yeah, I mean, some countries are doing much more than others. I think we don't have any country yet that is like fully embracing everything that is needed. But for example, Costa Rica, they abolished their army in 1948, and now they're saying at the same scale they have to make the next transformation to becoming fossil fuel free. That's kind of the doctrine of their current president, and that's not a new doctrine. That has already been proposed by former presidents as well. So Costa Rica is strongly committed to becoming carbon neutral. We also see countries like, nations, not a country, but nations like Scotland that have very aggressively moved CO2 emissions down from where they were 20 years ago. Obviously, Germany, for example, they're doing an energy transition, hasn't achieved as much, for example, as Scotland, but there are efforts around the world, just not at that scale of the problem yet. I think it's not recognized. We don't recognize how dramatic the situation is and why it's actually in our self-interest to act. We always say, wow, why should we do something for humanity? But it actually is about doing something for yourself. A city, a country that is not ready for the future is not ready for the future. Invest in yourself to adopt yourself to what's going to come, and you'll be able to be successful. And if not, you'll bear the consequences.
Finally, Mr. Vakernagel, just bringing this full circle now back to Australia. What about Australia itself? Do you think there are any policies that we should be working on right now to make our difference in the world?
As I said, nobody should do anything. It's a question of do you want to have a successful future? That's the question. If you want to have a successful future, if you recognize that we only live on one planet, I would recommend to much more seriously look at the physical conditions you live in. Australia is incredibly lucky in having a lot of resources available per person because it's not so densely populated compared to the rest of the world. So you have a lot of biocapacity available in your own country, but it's not managed at optimal levels. So I would far more focus on the question on to what extent is the competitiveness of Australia depending on managing your biocapacity assets well. And I think that hasn't been at the center of the Australian debate, unfortunately.
Quite a lot to think about there. Matthias Vakernagel, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.